Recently, I've gotten a handful of comments asking about my Pimax here. So, I thought that I would make a review to address some of them and answer the question, is this thing worth it? Well, I've had this HMD for a little over a year and a half now, and it has been quite an experience compared to most of the other ones I've tried. Pimax is trying to do something no other company is on the consumer sphere, and that's attempting to bring a wide FOV onto the market. But is this really all that, and are some of the trade-offs that, in order to accomplish that, worth it? Well, that's what I'm going to take a look at today. A few quick disclaimers, notes about this. Pimax released a hardware revision of the 8KX, which makes some minor changes, supposedly improving things like the colors and the backlight, and then some not-so-minor tweaks, such as breaking compatibility with AMD graphics cards, and 120Hz mode at native resolution being in beta. This review covers the older version of the 8KX, which is the KDMOS version, and then the revised is the DMOS. Yeah, but for the most part, the experiences are pretty similar based on everything I've read, and I haven't tried the revised version, but for the most part, comments that are applicable to this should also be applicable to that. The core experience is not going to change all that much. And secondly, all the footage of the games in here will be a mix between large and normal FOV, except when noted. See if you can tell the difference. Now, let's start with the point everyone is here for with this review, and why you would even buy a Pimax. The FOV, and is it really all that special?
The 8KX has 4 FOV modes: large, normal, small, and potato. In a moment, I will be showing uncropped footage of all of these to try and illustrate the FOV differences, as when I crop to maintain the aspect ratio, it cuts out a little bit of FOV, and I feel like this is the best way to illustrate just how much more you see between each one. Keep in mind this is also just the right eye's view. You'll see much more in the HMD itself as you're getting both of them. These FOV settings correspond to 160 at large, 140 at normal, 120 at small, and 100 degrees horizontal field of view at potato, which is close to what most current headsets get. All these settings come with about 103 vertical FOV and run at a max of 90 Hz at native, with 75 and 60 Hz as additional options. Likewise, all of these numbers have been sourced from RISA 2000's HMD database, which records what the reported FOV is by the headset itself, link in the description, alongside some other great features like stereo overlap. No marketing smoke and mirrors here. Alongside my own testing with the Test HMD application right here. These are some real high numbers when you look at most of the competition, such as the Index having only around 108 and the Vive Pro 2 with 116. And then the Reverb G2 doesn't even break 100 degrees. It can be a little hard to convey exactly how it feels without trying on the HMD yourself, but this is about the best way I think I can do. There's quite a difference between the settings when side by side though. After a while, the initial wow factor of the FOV might wear off a bit, but when going back to small settings or on a much smaller HMD, such as the Quest 2, I really notice the lack of peripheral vision. It's such a difference in shooters when I can see myself about to get spawn camped. I would have died without knowing what the hell happened on a smaller HMD. Likewise, the sense of speed everything zipping by in your cockpit provides, you just don't get that feeling with smaller FOV headsets. The in-game world just feels more expansive when you can see more and truly shines in places with wide open areas such as Zenith or Skyrim. But, like anything else though, I think FOV has some diminishing returns before other parts become more important. But part of that may be the lens design, which I'll touch on a little bit later. Going from small to normal felt a bit more significant in removing the feeling of blinders than going from normal to large did. I still like to play on large when I can, don't get me wrong, but I don't think going past normal is going to have the same wow factor on this HMD for some people, and they may prefer the extra performance one can get from normal, as large is quite intensive. Speaking of performance, there's one major caveat to this SOV that comes into play on certain games, but I will cover that under the performance section a little bit later. But anyway, with the FOV done, for now, let's talk about lenses and the overall clarity. Because as many people will attest to who have tried out the Index and Vive Pro 2, they have so much glare on their lenses it's like having a staring contest with the sun. Lens design matters. And boy, there is a lot to talk about because look at the damn size of these things. And boy, does the Index look tiny by comparison with those lenses. But how's the sweet spot? Some people have complained about a tiny sweet spot on Pimax, and what good's the FoV if it is horribly distorted and looks like everything's melting at the edges, right? Well, in my case, the sweet spot was gigantic. Biggest out of any HMD I've used, and I've got experience with the original Vive Pro 1 and 2, Index, Reverb G2, Quest 2, the 8KX, and then a 5K+. I don't have the exact way to measure it well, but while it wasn't all the Quest 2's FoV big, it definitely felt like most of it. I consider a little past that somewhat legible outside of small details, like, say, text. However, it's enough that, even for smaller stuff, I felt kind of able to look around with my eyes, less than moving my head, as is the case with all the others I've used. However, there's still a large portion of the lenses outside the sweet spot, and if I want to read something, I have to move it in focus. But even in the blurry spots, you can still see some things, and it helps a lot with immersion or just reacting to what's coming at you in the game world. So, better than most, but still not perfect. The next thing is distortions, something which is a common complaint on Pimax. I don't really have anything to complain about here. On large FOV, there is a very tiny little sliver in the corners, but nothing I really notice even without actively trying to find it, as it does not bother me in gameplay. If you use it, I'd recommend trying both the 15 and 11mm face foams, as based on user reports, Pimax is extremely temperamental in getting on a sweet spot, and some had less or more distortions based on their face foam. And on that note, I have to get to some of the negatives of the 8KX, particularly getting your IPD right and the colors. As well, overall, things are a nice package on the clarity and lens aspect. There are still some important things to touch over you should know before getting this. Firstly, colors. It's less that they're bad and more not that great out of the box, which is going to be a bit of a running theme here as we go forward. I found the 8KX perfectly usable stock, but the default calibration when it comes to things such as colors and eye strain are lacking. Fortunately, PyTool gives users so many options to customize their experience and dial in the HMD. However, this double-edged sword, because having to do that at all is definitely not for everyone. Some people prefer something that's just plug and play, working out of the box experience, just don't give me anything to fiddle with. And Pimax HMDs are definitely designed to be tinkered with, but once you properly dial in the color settings, credit to Pippi from the MRTV Discord from these, it looks pretty great. The second best colors I've had right behind the Vive Pro 2. Though it is on the dimmer side and you can adjust the brightness a little if you prefer brighter, I ended up going something like this after my own trial and error testing. There's also an IPD guide using information compiled by Super Saiyan 3 in Discord, which MRTV made a good video on, link in the description. Depending on the person, these may not be exactly necessary, and the 8KX will still be usable. I have several relatives who've used a few VR headsets, and none had issues with the 8KX. In fact, I tried playing around with it, and I didn't see a major difference with the IPD guide, personally. However, what I did notice was that setting the IPD to something smaller than usual helped keep both my eyes in the sweet spot and clear. I have an IPD around 86, but setting it to around 66 produced optimal results for me. I believe this is due to the lens cant, so I advise setting your IPD a little bit below what you're used to. Experiment, find what works. These HMDs aren't going to be for everyone though, because of how finicky they are and the time it takes to get the settings right. This issue is then compounded by the fact that much of this is not immediately obvious to someone unless they go hunting out in the community. You gotta go deep into the community to find some of this stuff and the answers. In general, there is poor official documentation and help available when it comes to these issues, and trying to find solutions, even among the community, can feel like a headache and a needle in a haystack if you're not deep into it. But with everything properly set up, I think the 8KX has fantastic visuals. The overall sharpness is slightly below that of the Vive Pro 2 and G2, but has a noticeable step up from the Index and somewhat from the Quest 2, all while having that gorgeous wide FOV. Screen door effect is functionally solved, I'd say, technically still there in certain contexts and situations, and if you do look for it, you can find it, but those are rare and you're not going to see it too much unless you're actively trying to find it. And stereo overlap is a little bit low, but it's not distractingly low like with the Vive Pro 2, and I still got decent 3D effect out of it. As another benefit, lenses have little glare on them compared to most, especially the Index or Vive Pro 2, if that is something that bothers you. But it's still there like with any Fresnel solution.
On to build quality and comfort. Well, the 8KX is pretty stockily built and has endured a year and a half of heavy use pretty well. It feels nice, it looks nice, and it's fairly durable. I also like the volume up and down buttons here, wish more HMDs had it. Still really miss my microphone mute button though, that the HTC Vive Pro models had. But aside from that, things held it pretty well for me without any problems in my time using it. However, I do have to note that QC seems to be kinda hit or miss when it comes to Pimax. I've heard a decent amount of stories or seen people have to RMA multiple times or just get issues on units on arrival. However, that's despite the fact that I personally have not had that issue, but I do feel like I have to mention it because I've seen the problem often enough. I also have to mention that I have tried an 8KX before this, and that one felt worse in terms of things like the distortions and all that, but I cannot say for certain if that was because of different firmware versions with how long ago it was, or it was just because of QC issues. And anyway, comfort-wise, the 8KX is... well, it's a pretty big lad here. Let's take a look at the Quest 2. Look at this thing compared to the Quest 2, the Franken Quest. I mean, it's pretty small compared to the absolute unit that is the Pimax headset. And look, there's even I've even got some pictures to share with it. A few images as well to get a better look at compared to the Quest. And another photo of it beside the Index. Some people don't like the modular audio strap that Pimax has, says it wobbles a lot, but while also being front heavy. Personally, I'm a big guy, and I have a big head. Don't make any jokes in the comments section. And so it fits me fairly snugly. And yeah, stock it is kind of front heavy, but I found around 200 grams of counterweights here. Helps take the pressure off my front and my nose, and helps a fair bit on terms of balance. With these counterweights and comparing it to all the other headsets I've used, which also were using counterweights, I rate the 8KX as upper mid-level comfort. While it's not as light and comfy as the Reverb G2 or the Quest 2 with an aftermarket strap, it's still fine for use even after hours of play, and doesn't hurt my neck using it. Also doesn't feel as toasty as the Vive Pro or the Quest 2 can sometimes get, and the cowling or face foam fits large faces rather well versus something like the Index, which was just awful for me without a replacement gasket. If you do have a big nose though, I have heard a couple complaints about the nose pressure, so be careful with that.
As for performance, well, this thing is a black hole at dual 4K per eye. Far higher after barrel distortion. I have another video which goes more in depth on benchmarking the 3090 Ti and 4090 and a couple games using this, both at native and with the VR Perf kit. Go watch it here, or find it in the description. I think it'll explain itself well and the kind of horsepower you need, but to briefly touch on it, this thing's going to need a beefy system to run it properly without major compromise. Anything less than the 4090 is going to require some dialing in or compromise on almost any game. I would consider a 3060 Ti or better the baseline to make this decent use of it, and even that's kind of stretching it. 3080 or better would be an ideal recommendation from me, but stronger you can get, the better, of course. Yes, the 8KX does have an upscale mode from 1440p to 4K if you really need to get extra performance, but I've known maybe 2 people that have used it, and I've only tried it once before deciding it wasn't worth the huge image quality loss, so I'm not going to talk about it. Next.
This brings me back to what I mentioned in the FoV section. One of the trade-offs that Pimax uses to get this wide FoV is canted displays, kind of like the Index but to a much bigger degree. In some games, they just really don't like that. This results in some really bad rendering issues on certain games, which I can't exactly demonstrate properly in a recording, unfortunately, but this can range from distracting yet playable, such as weird culling or poppin', to flat-out unplayable double vision that'll have you looking like the gunner from Spaceballs. I sure hope I am not the only one who is going to get that. Anyway, to get around this, one needs to enable parallel projections in PyTool. This brute forces the problem, but at a massive performance hit. Around 30% on large FoV from what everyone's saying, and I briefly checked out. But it gets smaller as you reduce the FoV size, although not sure to quite what extent, and because I've almost never used it, as what I play pretty much doesn't need it. And on that note, in most games, this is actually not a problem. Pimax has done a pretty good job with working some developers to help prevent the issue caused by canted displays and get them to make it compatible. But a few notable titles do still have some issues with this, and because of the huge performance hit, this can mean dialing down settings or FOV significantly to get playable frame rates, and is something one should be mindful of if they mainly play these games. As for sound quality, well, I'm not too big of an audio guy, so I don't have a lot to say here, but I like the KD mods, I like these. I found it comparable to the Vive DAS and the Vive Pro solutions, but not up to the Index or the G2. And, yeah, cable solution is a little inconvenient. They got a kind of a splitter thing right here. As for the microphone, well, you can hear me using it right now, I hope. And, yeah, it's pretty good. For the most part, no issues. Very rarely there is kind of a problem where it'll just kind of sort of cut out or like go very robotic and staticky. But that happens relatively inconsistently, and in general, it's good. I mean, it'll work fine for social VR. It's probably a little bit of one of the better microphones out on VR headsets. Far from the best, though. Index is still the gold standard for any HMD's microphone. That thing is amazing. But it is still way better than whatever dollar store dumpster bin HTC got theirs out of. But that again brings me to another elephant in the room, and I do this every review. How's the value proposition on the headset? At the time of this video, only the 8KX DMOS is available, which is also the new version, and currently $1,179 USD, not counting taxes or shipping. The website says it is on sale from its MSRP of $1,387 USD, but I have seen it hovering around. I've seen it hovering around $1,200 USD for like a year now. I have not seen it cost over $1,300 in ages. And so I think that's effectively the new standard price, despite whatever it says about there being a sale. So that's the comparison I'm going to be using for this. But before getting into that, one quick thing I do have to mention, though, is that you technically do not need base stations for seated games, like some sims, because this can do 3DOF tracking called 9-axis mode, where you can only rotate your head like this, it's kind of like it's on a swivel, and you cannot physically move. But even a single base station is going to give you 6DOF, and is such a massive improvement. Like this stuff, you cannot do that if you lack a base station. And so I really recommend picking up at least one, but if you do need to really stretch your budget, that is something to consider for the value proposition. Now, anyway, do I think this is worth the cost, factoring in base stations and controllers as well? Do I think it is worth over double the cost of the Index? Double the cost of the Reverb G2 complete kit for the HMD alone? 300 more than the Vive Pro 2, or almost 800 more than the Quest 2. Well, more like 700 with all the mods people buy for it nowadays. But, well, I love this thing. For most people, unless VR is your holy grail, you've got some spare money, and you're okay with tinkering to fine-tune your experience, I'm not sure. I think for a very specific type of person that they will get a lot of enjoyment out of this. But if you just want to plug your device in and play, this probably isn't the most friendly thing. Plus, there's a lot on the horizon from more than just Pimax. And if you also want FOV bar on a budget, there's things like the 5K Super as well, which is a significant downgrade on visuals. It's a little bit worse than the Index, but it can do up to 180 Hz and also has the same FOV, though only at 120. So let's do a little bit of a lightning round comparing some of the popular HMDs. On the index front, I find the 8KX destroys it in pretty much everything but audio quality and higher hertz on the index. But for being 600 or more, I mean, it kind of should, considering the price. The index holds up okay, I guess, but it's almost 3 years old now and really showing its age, MSRP to MSRP. I couldn't really recommend the index, one of the $700 GameStop kits, though. Much more compelling option if you get it for that. G2, well, that's kind of a whole different planet of cost when factoring the expense of a complete kit versus complete kit of the 8KX. It's like $1,700 versus $600. But that's only the place the G2 really holds up is the off-ear audio and a slightly better clarity and the sweet spot, which itself is very small on a very tiny FoV. But if the G2 could compete with the 8KX outside of that one or two areas it specialized in, it kind of looked really bad for Pimax, don't you think? Good for Sims or if chasing the best clarity on a budget. Vive Pro 2, slightly wider FoV than its competitors, but the cost is some vertical. Got somewhat better colors and sharpness, and it's capable of 120Hz, but less FoV, still far below Pimax. It runs hot, and the lenses just have enough glare to flashbang your eyes. The software was also horribly buggy when I used it, but at a little over 300 more, the value comparison gets less weight. I recommend the 8KX over the Vive Pro 2 every single time. And lastly, Quest 2. 3 times cheaper than the 8KX alone, and practically 4.5 considering the full kit cost, but has awful FOV, awful default strap and stock comfort, compression could be a problem for PC VR, wired or wireless, and on the other hand, it's cheap, has standalone features to not need an expensive PC, wireless potential of PC VR, and immense support given the user base size. Depending on how much you value wireless, assuming you're even considering both and the absurd price gaps of this doesn't swing you one way. And as for the 8KX itself, has unmatched FOV blowing away the competition, clarity well above the index, and only a little bit below the two sharper options, strong colors for a VR headset, and its ability to customize your experience with options that no other HMD gives. Yet that same ability to customize could potentially mean a less than ideal or even bad out-of-the-box experience, and requires a long time fine-tuning to get it more in line with other HMDs that work well out of the box. And some people have to go through hell troubleshooting for hours to days to even make it work. Plus there's the cost! However, despite that, the 8KX is still my favorite HMD that I have tried out of the 8 I have used. I've been fortunate to have no significant issues with this, and it just works great. I'm quite happy with mine and will continue to use it, but if I were to recommend it, there would be a couple asterisks. Get it from somewhere with a good return policy, like Amazon. Be prepared to tinker or troubleshoot with the HMD to get it working right, and make sure you have a strong rig. But even then, unless your FOV is your holy grail, I might wait a few months to see what hits the market and what's in store. But speaking of future HMDs, what about the 12K trade-in program, you may ask? That gives you an upgrade path without a huge loss, right? Well, I'll be frank. For those considering it, don't worry about it and don't buy this with the trade-in program in mind as the main reason. Pimax already missed their deadline with the Crystal release in Q3, so I'm skeptical of Q4 for the 12K. The headset could come in a month, or it could come in several. And if it happens to come sooner rather than later, well, you lose out on the tax and shipping costs for the trade-in program. So just wait for the 12K in that case. You should not buy one product on the promise of another that doesn't even have a hard release date. If you buy this, buy it because you want what it offers at this time. I love my HMD, but sometimes the company can be pretty messy on deadlines and promises. And those are my thoughts on the 8KX. If you liked it, review, let me know. Got any experiences with the 8KX or found yours different from mine? Comment that too. Later.